Welcome to this module about social impact assessment, a core part of a social performance management system. I'm Dr. Anthony Kung. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining within the Sustainable Minerals Institute, the University of Queensland. Social Impact Assessment, or SIA, is a process of assessing and managing social impacts. In a social performance management system, it is most relevant to the plan phase because it allows site-based staff to anticipate social impacts. It is also relevant to the do and check phases, as we'll discuss in this module. Some organizations refer to SIA as an SIOA, a social impact and opportunities assessment. For the purposes of this module, we'll consider them to be the same thing. We are focusing on SIA not just because it's part of a social performance management system, but because SIA is increasingly part of regulatory requirements around the world, industry expectations, and international standards. Take, for example, the Environment Act of Papua New Guinea. Under this act, certain projects are required to undertake an environmental impact assessment. Social, economic, aesthetic, and cultural conditions are considered part of the environment. The recent Impact Assessment Act of Canada also has similar provisions. In Australia, courts have rejected projects on the basis of social impacts, and regulators have issued guidelines indicating how social impact assessment is to be undertaken. Within the mining industry, the ICMM, or International Council on Mining and Metals, has also issued guidelines on social impact assessment. And many funders and companies rely on the performance standards of the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, to guide the conduct of environmental and social impact assessment. In this module, we'll cover what is a social impact, what is social impact assessment, the role of SIA in a social performance management system, and we'll briefly discuss common issues arising in the mining context. By the end of this module, you'll be able to describe what a social impact is and describe common social impacts in mining contexts. You'll be able to describe the steps in undertaking an SIA and state how SIA contributes to a site-based social performance management system. The definition of social impact is typically very broad. The IFC, for example, defines a social impact as any change, potential or actual, on surrounding community and workers resulting from the business activity, in our case, mining. The International Association for Impact Assessment has a similarly broad definition. In a mining project, the central question for SIA is, how might the mining project affect different groups of people? This statement can be adjusted to fit your situation. You might ask instead, how might mine expansion or mine closure affect people? You might ask, how has mining affected people in the last 5 years? A retrospective rather than a prospective question. In general, we can think of social impacts as how people's lives have changed as a result of a project. Identifying social impacts requires us to understand what people's lives were like before the project and what people's lives will be like if the project is carried out. Take a minute to think about the social impacts that you have observed or managed at your site. How have your operations affected people? Who has been affected, and in what ways? Social impacts are not restricted to adverse or negative impacts. Social impacts can be positive because the project can boost what people value. For example, mining often brings employment and business opportunities that result in increased income for employees and business owners. Some impacts are mixed, involving positive and negative consequences for different people. For example, increased income as a result of mining might be spent on tobacco, alcohol, or junk food, leading to increased incidences of related health problems. On the other hand, the increased income might lead to better educational outcomes because school fees for employees' children are now more affordable. This example shows how social impacts can arise not just from the activities of a mine, but also from people's responses to mining activity. The terms direct and indirect impact relate to this idea. Direct impacts arise directly from project activities. For example, a project might employ people from local communities. Increased employment is the direct impact. Indirect impacts arise because the project drives changes to the social, economic, and/or political environment, and people respond to those changes. For example, the project workforce may spend money in local shops, which boosts those businesses. A stimulated local economy is an indirect impact. The price of goods could also arise as a result. Decreased affordability of food for some people could be another indirect impact. There isn't a single definition for social impact assessment. In this module, let's define it as the process of identifying and analyzing the social issues of a project. In this module, we break down social impact assessment as a process comprising 6 steps. We'll go through each of these steps, except for the first one, build a knowledge base, because that is the subject of another module in this series. The general idea behind building a knowledge base is to conduct social studies to understand how mine-affected communities function, what they value, and what contributes to and detracts from their well-being. The second step of SIA is impact identification. In this step, what the project proposes to do or has been doing is considered against the baseline knowledge. As we discussed earlier, the central question is, how might the mine affect different groups of people? There is no single way to go about impact identification. At this point, take a moment to consider the 8 general categories of people's well-being as described in Smythe and Van Clay's 2017 paper. These 8 categories can be used as a guide for thinking about what the impacts could be. Having identified the impacts, the third step is assessing impacts. This generally means finding a way to prioritize them, highlighting the most significant impacts. There is no single way to do this, but a common way is to identify how likely the impact is to arise, and if it does arise, how serious the consequences would be. The table pictured on this slide shows likelihood and consequence, each with a 5-point scale, likelihood ranging from rare to almost certain, and consequence ranging from insignificant to catastrophic. Together, they form a matrix where the significance of the risk or impact can be considered low, moderate, high, or extreme. Be aware that some people define impact as an event that has already occurred and as such can't be assessed for likelihood. This view would use the language of risks or potential impacts, which only become actual impacts if or when they occur. This distinction is reasonable, but won't be adopted in this module for simplicity's sake. What should be done about the impacts that we have identified and assessed? The fourth step is devising ways to manage those impacts, sometimes called management measures. Management measures seek to avoid, mitigate, or reduce the significance of adverse impacts and enhance any positive impacts that have been identified. Take a moment to consider the 3 impacts listed in the green box. What management measures might be developed to address them? Pause the video if you need. Some suggested responses appear on the next slide. At this point, we've identified impacts, assessed their significance, and proposed management measures for each impact. Often, the company commits to the management measures and they become part of the project design. The 5th step is to reassess the impacts on the basis that the management measures will be implemented. Sometimes the first assessment of impacts is called an initial impact assessment, i.e. the significance of the impact before management measures are proposed. The second assessment is called the residual or mitigated impact assessment, i.e. the significance that is left or residual, assuming management measures are implemented. These 5 steps comprise the core process of SIA. There is one more step, which sometimes is not counted as being part of the SIA, but is nonetheless an important link between the SIA and social performance practice. That step, which we will consider to be step 6, is to convert the management measures into a coherent plan of action, often called a Social Impact Management Plan, or SIMP. The SIMP typically groups related management measures together, decides how they will be implemented, when, by whom, in what order, with what resources, and under whose authority within the company, and articulates a monitoring and evaluation program which keeps track of A, whether the management measures are being carried out, and B, whether the management measures are achieving the outcomes they are supposed to. Although these steps are conceptually straightforward, in practice they require specialist social scientists with an understanding of social research methods and the local context of the mine. Along with building a knowledge base, conducting an SIA is critical in a social performance management system. It is primarily relevant to the plan phase of the PDCA cycle because SIA allows impacts and risks to be identified and for management measures to be developed accordingly. The do, check, and act phases are connected to the SIA, but are strictly speaking outside the scope of the SIA. The do phase involves carrying out management measures in accordance with the SIMP, the Social Impact Management Plan. The check phase involves monitoring and evaluation, that is, checking and evaluating the effectiveness of management measures as well as the degree and nature of social change experienced. The act phase involves adjustments to social performance strategy as a result of the monitoring and evaluation, as well as to company activities. Meaningful engagement is relevant to all of these phases. It's also relevant to SIA in two ways. Firstly, the data collection that allows the SIA to be developed in the first place is a form of engagement. Secondly, the dissemination of results following an SIA should be considered part of a stakeholder engagement management plan. Meaningful engagement is the subject of another module, and I won't talk about it too much here. This part of the module highlights common issues arising from mining-related SIAs. We discussed the social impact as something experienced by people affected by a project. One of the tricky questions about SIA is, who is affected by a project? There's a chicken and egg situation here. You need to know who's affected in order to define the scope of the SIA, but until you've done the SIA, you don't really know who's affected. My general advice is to accept that the scope of the SIA shouldn't be fixed rigidly at the start of the study, but should be fluid and adapt as the study progresses. This often adds time and cost to the SIA. The SIA should be closely integrated with the environmental impact assessment. Many social impacts are consequential upon environmental impacts. For example, contaminated land and water is prima facie an environmental impact, but it also has social ramifications because people depend on land and water. Similarly, SIA should be integrated with cultural heritage management planning, as discussed in another module in this series. Because mining takes up land, how land will be affected and whose land will be affected is frequently a key issue in mining SIAs. Projects have been significantly delayed or have become uncommercial due to landowner disputes. Often, there are legislative processes for determining land ownership. It is usually not the role of the SIA specialist to determine who owns what land, but it is a contentious area that the SIA practitioner should both keep in mind and take care not to overstep. Artisanal small-scale mining frequently coincides with large-scale mining. When they interact, complex issues can arise. The Center for Social Responsibility in Mining has published a paper on the interface between small and large-scale mining, which is referenced at the end of this module. Mining often involves an influx of capital that is transformative to a region. The economics of mining, including royalties, compensation, employment, and procurement, often warrant specialist economic expertise as part of an SIA. Health and education, because of their centrality to human well-being, are usually topics of considerable analysis in SIAs. Both are specialist fields, and health impact assessments are sometimes commissioned separately in mining SIAs, particularly where toxicity studies are required, such as when examining the effect of tailings on water quality and food safety. SIAs should specifically consider how Indigenous peoples are affected by mining. The IFC Performance Standard 7, Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be key guidance documents in these SIAs. Finally, human rights and the SDGs are often discussed in mining-related SIAs. Some SIAs include a human rights impact assessment, although often a human rights impact assessment is commissioned as a complementary study to an SIA. The Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining has recently completed a human rights impact assessment for a project in Papua New Guinea, which is referenced at the end of this module. This module has emphasized that social impacts are broadly defined and include anything linked to a project that affects or concerns any impacted stakeholder group. We've discussed the 6 steps typically involved in conducting an SIA, and we've talked about how the SIA is critical mostly to the planning stage of the PDCA cycle. We've also talked about common issues that arise in mining-related SIAs.